Ashford Social Media presents an interview with Kimberly Berg, a male feminist artist and frequent guest on Ashford Publishing Radio. Let's get started by telling us a little bit about yourself.
I'm an artist. I've been practicing my art since the early 80s. I started out actually writing poetry. I won a poetry contest in high school. It took a national prize. It was a sonnet. And that sort of started me off thinking out more that I was a writer than anything else. But I always did see myself as being artistic. But eventually, I did get poems published. I became a member of Poets and Writers, but I became very discouraged with the publishing industry. And around when I was about my 40s, I turned to art because that always attracted me as well. So I started doing first pen and ink drawings, and then charcoal, and then from there I went to color and to pastels. And I really liked it, and I found it a lot easier to break into the art world than into the publishing world. So I began thinking of myself not only as a writer, but also as a visual artist.
Where did you receive your art training?
Well, I never took formal training. When I was in college, I followed basically humanitarian courses. I graduated with a history major. I never took art while in the university. I never went to an art school. So it's all self-training. And when I was living in New York City for about 3 years, I always went to the galleries and to the museums, and I really enjoyed, studying the paintings and absorbing a lot of what was going on. Then finally, when I took an interest in actually doing my own work, this was like in the 80s, I already had absorbed a lot of information, and I knew almost intuitively what worked and what doesn't work. I have a natural ability to know a composition that works, and that can't be learned. You have to know that intuitively. And so I had that going for me from the very beginning, and whatever else I needed to know, I was able to learn from books or from what I observed other artists doing.
What kind of medium do you use for your art?
I started just with pen and ink, and that seems simple enough, but even pen and ink is you can't erase it. Whatever you do is there, and you just have to work around it if you make a mistake. So, but that's how I started out, and I enjoyed it, and I got some good comments from what I was doing. I have a way of creating a sensitivity that you can express almost in any medium, but it even came out in pen and ink, which is not an easy medium to work with, to create that kind of an effect. And then from pen and ink, I went to charcoal, and that also is a lot of fun to work with. You're working more with different tonalities, you're working with shadows and with contrasts, but you're not working with colors, so you're spared that big problem in art, that takes real work with. And then finally, when I gained enough confidence that I was able to draw the figure, which was my main interest almost from the beginning, I started working with pastels, but I usually used a very minimalist approach. My lifestyle is very simple, and my artistic style, painting style, is also very simple and what we would call minimalist style. I would like to work with just a very few colors, sometimes just with one color, and using different tonalities of that color. I feel that less is more, and less makes for a more powerful image. And for me, my main concern is the image. Everything depends on the image.
What is your artistic style?
My life is very simple, and as a result, I prefer a minimalist approach to my art. And that's the best way I can express it. I don't feel that I have to fill the entire page or the entire paper with something. I like to leave a lot of empty spaces where there's nothing happening. And that is basically using a minimalist style. It's same as in music, where you're repeating the same note over and over with slight variations. So there is that acceptance of low, very, very simple images in the art world.
In what way are you a minimalist?
Well, I live in a cabin in the woods. I have no access to electricity. I live beyond the power grid. I have no running water. I collect my water from a spring in the woods. I'm surrounded by trees, by nature, by animals. And living this way is, you have to depend on your own resources and your own ingenuity. And it means that you're living without a lot of things. And most people have a really hard time understanding how I can live without taking a daily shower. And for me, that was never a big problem. When I was, my entire youth, we lived in the country, and we had a bathtub, and once a week on Saturday, we took a bath. That was it. So for me, taking a shower every day never seemed that important.
Did you choose to live like this to enhance your art?
Well, I didn't have very much money. I had to live on a very, very slim budget. And so you have to live as simply as possible. If you build your own cabin, which is what I did, and I paid for the land. I had saved enough money when I was working in New York City to buy the land. And building the cabin myself, using used lumber, I was able to manage on a very low budget. And living like that it had nothing to do with my art at the time. I wasn't even creating art at that time. But I wanted to be an artist, and I knew that I didn't have very much money. So I had to pare my lifestyle down to the very basic minimum. And it worked.
Who do you admire as an artist?
Since I started working basically with the human figure, I like artists. The artist that I really like is Vermeer. He painted his women in such a way that they don't attract attention to themselves. They were usually lost in their own thoughts. They're usually in almost kind of a meditative state. And I really like that approach to using the figure as not as something, as an object to look at, but as an object that's complete in itself.
Why do you consider yourself a male feminist artist?
That is a pretty long story. It starts with the fact that I was living in New York City in the 60s, and that was the beginning of the women's liberation movement. And graduating with a history major, I realized from the beginning that this was not just a fad or a trend. I thought this was a turning point in history. But even at that time, I thought it was just something that women would have to work out for themselves. So I didn't feel any need to get involved in it myself. Then, in 1997, I read a book by Lane Redman called When the Drummers Were Women. And that changed everything for me, because she traces the history of women's drumming that goes all the way back to the late Paleolithic times, like 30,000 BC, and then follows women's evolution, and but not only in relationship to drumming, but also in relationship to the fact that women also were the ones who first created a civil society based on female values. Now, this is something I never studied in history. Our history never went further back than the Greeks and the Romans. Now we're talking about history that happened before history, what we would call the prehistorical record. And since by being prehistoric means that this was before history could be recorded, before there was even a language in which to record something. And this was, so the prehistorical period was when women were very active. They created their own civil society, and it was a completely different society that we know of now. And most people are completely unaware that were any other society besides the patriarchal society that we live in today. I believe that the patriarchal system that we live under is very unfair and unjust towards women, and even morally irresponsible. And I identify with women, and I can see how they are suffering because of this system. And this is something that's been going on for 5,000 years, even more than that. And how this could be perpetuated for such a long time is just beyond what I can understand. I feel that any man of any moral conscience would find such a situation intolerable. I'm basically rebelling against that whole system of patriarchy and how it's treated women. And when I realized the scope of the problem, I immediately wanted to figure a way, how can I address this through art by using the image as a source of conveying a message. And it didn't happen overnight, but gradually I worked out a way of drawing the figure and drawing images that represented what had happened in Neolithic times, when women were free and when they were in control of their lives.
What are your future plans?
Actually, I'm becoming more involved in presenting this message than actually creating more paintings. My painting is, I'm creating maybe 1 or 2 paintings a year. That's just, but I'm putting a lot of effort into putting out the message. This is just one example of it. I also created a PowerPoint program which covers the whole Neolithic period when women were creating their own civilization, their own society based on female values. And I think this is very important because so few people are aware of this period in history. And I think it's very important, especially for women, to be aware of it, but also men.
What kind of reaction have you had from women? Do you think women feel you can really empathize with them being a man?
Yes, I've never had problems with that. My female friends have always been very open to me, and I've always felt a lot of empathy towards women, and the struggles that they have to deal with. You know, they're dealing with divorce, single parents. You know, their life is really incredible. You know, and I do empathize with that, and women know that I really have a concern for how they live and what they have to put up with. So that's never been a problem. Also, the fact that I grew up with my sister. It was just my sister and myself. So living that close and playing and interacting with a woman, in this case my sister, I never felt that women were some sort of strange creatures that men have a really hard trying to relate to. I never had that problem. And so I'm thankful to my sister in the way we grew up, that I was able to relate to women throughout my life.
What is your vision of an ideal society?
That's what I'm trying to create, images that prepare the way for a new society in which female values would be emphasized. Values such as cooperation, compassion, respect for women, peaceful resolution of conflicts, life lived in harmony with nature. These are the things that I'm trying to promote by the way I live and what I try to create artistically.
What are your goals?
My real long-term goal is to create a foundation where this kind of art is promoted and where it can be viewed. The whole life could be laid out and studied. And I can remember in the afternoons, she would come sit in a rocking chair. She liked to smoke, so she was always smoking a cigarette and reading from stories from the Reader's Digest or books that we ordered from the library, state library. And that opened a whole new world for me. And then I wanted to start reading on my own. And I can still remember the first book I read was Treasure Island. And I was fascinated. It was a book that was at least 3 inches thick. And I read it from cover to cover. And I had the same experience as when I was listening to my mother read to me. And that's what started me off, writing, poetry, and the whole field of literature.
I think this is a good question, and you have a question here. Does the fact that the figures usually do have any special relevance? Because in answering that question, a lot of your pictures have a sensual undertone to them, I would think. Is there anything you want to say about that? I mean, because some feminists might say that's the wrong direction to go. You're really pushing the body here when this is more about our character and who we are as people versus our... So go ahead, let's respond to that.
Well, what I'm really doing is just continuing what Paleolithic artists were working with. All their work was used the nude female body, and for them, the nude body was not shameful. It was nothing that they had to cover up. For them, the body was a symbol of honor and mysterious power. So their whole concept of the body was much different from what we have today under patriarchy. And it's basically patriarchy that's created this whole idea that the body there's something wrong with it, and it's dirty, and it's something that is a constant temptation for men. And I want to go back to the Paleolithic idea of the body, where it's regarded with awe and reverence. It's beautiful, and it's mysterious, and it creates life. Why should we be ashamed of it?
Okay. I'm not sure if this is on a personal thing. I mean, I'm not a big history buff with cavemen or Paleolithic and one of that, but I did read Planet the Cave Bear. I'm not sure if you ever read that book.
Yeah, I
But I
did.
know Isla was like, there were some issues. Unless you were a medicine woman, you didn't really have a lot of authority. So I'm not. I can't be sure if those artists in those times were patriarchal or not. But I guess this is an opinion, since there's no history could be kept.
Actually, patriarchy didn't begin until about the same time that writing was invented. If you read The Chalice and the Blade by Riane Eisler, she describes this whole period very closely. And what I'm basing my understanding of the period is based on what modern archaeology and anthropology has uncovered within the last maybe 50 years. And the whole study of archaeology and their understanding of the prehistorical period has gone through huge changes within recent years. And a lot of it was due to the excavation at Çatalhöyük, which is a Neolithic village in Turkey. And from what they found there, made it quite clear that women were pretty much in charge of what happened there, especially what happened in the home, but also in their religious ceremonies as well. Çatalhöyük was a trading center, but also a religious center, and pilgrims, would come there to take part in the festivals and ceremonies that they had. So this was a completely a civilization and society completely different from what we understand today. And this all changed around 4000 BC, when there were nomadic tribes from Asia that swept into these areas and just destroyed everything, obliterated everything. And they worshipped not a female goddess, but a male goddess. And it was a male goddess who was very aggressive, very militaristic, and they changed everything. They reversed completely what preceded them. So patriarchy did not exist before this invasion by these nomadic tribes. Before that, it was a woman-centered society.
Ashford Social Media would like to thank Kim Berg for taking the time to speak with us today. This has been an Ashford Social Media production.